Most people assume that if a plant truly contained more protein than milk and an exceptional range of micronutrients, it would be impossible to ignore. In a rational food system, such a crop would dominate school lunch programs, military rations, and famine relief stockpiles. Yet, history shows that nutritional value alone has never guaranteed survival in the marketplace or in public memory. Some crops vanish, not because they failed, but because they did not fit the economic, political, or industrial structures that came to define modern food. Today's story is not about a battlefield defeat. It is about a quieter kind of erasure, the marginalization of nutrient-dense traditional crops, particularly amaranth, during the age of empire, industrial agriculture, and centralized food systems. Amaranth, a resilient plant cultivated for thousands of years in the Americas, contains more protein per weight than milk, a near-complete amino acid profile including lysine, and a dense array of vitamins and minerals. It thrives in poor soils and harsh climates, yet it was systematically suppressed in some regions and sidelined in others. Understanding why reveals more about power, survival, and preparedness than any single war chronicle. The plant once fed civilizations that understood resilience differently than we do. Long before European contact, amaranth was a staple crop in Mesoamerica. The Aztecs cultivated it alongside maize and beans in a complementary agricultural system that modern agronomists now recognize as nutritionally sophisticated. Amaranth compensated for maize's lysine deficiency. It provided protein density rare in plant foods. Its leaves were consumed as greens. Its seeds were ground into flour or popped like grain. But amaranth was not only food, it was ritual material. It was mixed with honey and formed into ceremonial figures. This cultural integration made it visible and vulnerable when Spanish colonizers arrived in the 16th century. The suppression of amaranth was not purely agricultural, it was ideological. Spanish authorities, seeking to dismantle indigenous religious structures, targeted crops linked to ceremonial practice. Amaranth fields were burned in certain regions. Cultivation was discouraged or outlawed in areas under strict colonial control. The goal was not simply conversion, but restructuring of society. Replace ritual crops with wheat. Replace local systems with European ones. Wheat required different land use, different tools, and different economic relationships. It tied colonial economies to European trade networks. Amaranth did not. This pattern, undermining local food resilience to consolidate political control, repeats throughout history. Empires rarely conquer through force alone. They reconfigure subsistence systems. They redirect calories. By the 18th and 19th centuries, amaranth had not disappeared entirely, but it had been marginalized. Maize remained dominant in many regions, while wheat expanded under colonial and later national agricultural policy. Amaranth survived in pockets, preserved by communities who understood its value but lacked the institutional power to scale it. Industrial agriculture favored uniformity over resilience. The 20th century accelerated this marginalization. Industrial agriculture prioritized crops that could be mechanized, standardized, and traded globally. Wheat, corn, rice, and soy became pillars not only of food systems, but of geopolitical strategy. They were easily stored, easily transported, and compatible with emerging subsidy structures. Amaranth did not integrate smoothly into that model. Its tiny seeds required different harvesting and processing methods. It did not benefit from the same research investment, It was categorized as minor or underutilized, yet nutritionally it rivaled or even exceeded many of the grains that replaced it. It contains high-quality protein with an amino acid balance that's pretty rare among plant sources. It is rich in iron, magnesium, calcium, and antioxidants. Its leaves are comparable to spinach in nutrient density. Plus, it is drought-resistant and tolerant of heat, traits that are, well, increasingly relevant in these unstable climates. But nutritional logic rarely overrides economic inertia. Once supply chains are built around just a handful of staple crops, alternatives really struggle for space. Subsidy systems reinforce this concentration. And food aid programs distribute what is abundant and logistically simple, not always what is most nutritionally complete. Wars in the 20th century, further narrowed global food diversity. Total war requires predictability. During both world wars, governments prioritized crops that could be scaled rapidly and stored long-term. Caloric output per acre became, well, absolutely central. Shelf stability and transport efficiency outweighed micronutrient diversity. In that context, standardized grains dominated. Amaranth, despite its resilience, just didn't have the institutional backing to compete. Agricultural research during the Green Revolution focused heavily on rice and wheat yields. Billions were invested in breeding programs to increase output of already dominant crops. Very little comparable investment went into so-called orphan crops. This had consequences. In regions dependent on a narrow range of staples, micronutrient deficiencies became widespread. Protein-energy malnutrition was addressed primarily through calorie expansion, not through diversification. The lesson was clear. Centralized food systems prioritize scale and stability over nutritional breadth. For survival-minded observers, this is not a trivial oversight. It reveals how modern systems can become brittle. When a small number of crops dominate global supply, disruption, whether from conflict, climate, or disease, carries systemic risk. Amaranth's resilience exposes the vulnerability of monoculture. Amaranth grows in marginal soils. It tolerates drought. It matures relatively quickly. Historically, such characteristics matter deeply in wartime and subsistence contexts. Crops that can survive neglect, poor weather, or limited inputs are strategic assets. During prolonged conflicts, from sieges to occupation periods, communities often reverted to hardy local plants to supplement rations. The Irish potato famine, the sieges of Leningrad and Sarajevo, and countless blockades demonstrate a consistent pattern. When centralized supply fails, diversity becomes survival. Amaranth represents that principle. For military planners and preparedness thinkers, this history carries weight. Strategic resilience depends on redundancy. A nation dependent on 3 or 4 major crops is more exposed than one that cultivates diversity. Nutritional adequacy under stress requires more than calories. It requires micronutrients that prevent long-term degradation of health. In prolonged crises, whether wartime rationing or climate-driven shortages, dense, adaptable crops can mean the difference between mere survival and functional endurance. Amaranth's story is not unique. Many traditional crops, millets, sorghum varieties, indigenous legumes, have followed similar paths. They were sidelined not because they lacked value, but because they did not fit the industrial template of the 20th century. Today, as climate volatility increases and, geopolitical supply chains show fragility, those overlooked crops deserve renewed attention. This is not nostalgia. It is strategic thinking informed by history. Understanding how and why nutrient-dense plants were marginalized really sharpens our awareness of systemic blind spots. It reminds us that progress narratives often obscure trade-offs. Efficiency can reduce diversity. Scale can weaken resilience. For those who study history seriously, the lesson is consistent. Societies that ignore the quiet foundations of sustenance often learn too late how essential they were. Amaranth survived because small communities refused to abandon it. That persistence preserved knowledge that centralized systems, well, overlooked. In an era increasingly defined by uncertainty, that kind of continuity is not backward-looking, it is prudent. If you value examining overlooked historical forces, the ones that shape endurance more than headlines do, subscribe to Iron Age Instincts. Share this video with others who prefer depth over summary. The lessons that matter most are often the ones history tried to sideline.